Let's start dialing in the range on the calendar in our efforts to calculate the date of Jesus' birth. This is the third video in our discussion of the timing of Jesus' birth, and the sixth video in our series, Chronology in the Life of Jesus. In the last two videos, we came up with a probable earliest possible date for Jesus' birth using the chronology from Luke, and we came up with the fall of 4 BC. That will be validated in this video. We also came up with a definite latest possible date of Jesus' birth in December of 1 BC, based on the latest possible date of the death of Herod the Great. In this video, I'll be using a source that some will find very interesting and others will find bothersome. Either way, I invite you not to judge a book by its cover. I'll be using the historical information provided in the Book of Mormon. You can find videos on the theology side of my channel that talk about why I believe what I believe, but for purposes of our video here, my studies have led me to the conclusion that although the Book of Mormon is not fundamentally about history, it does indeed contain real history from real people in the past. And so in this video, I'll be looking at the data provided in the Book of Mormon as a historical source, the same way we've been treating Appian, Dio Cassius, Josephus, Matthew, and Luke. The Book of Mormon chronology is internally very cohesive. You can figure out how far apart various events were. The trick is trying to align a date on the Nephite calendar with a known date on the Julian calendar. There appear to be three viable prospects. Number one is the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah. We know when that was on both calendars. The trouble is, it's almost 6 centuries prior to the point in time we're investigating here. And since we do not know the exact length of a Nephite year, an error in length of year of just a few days multiplied out by 6 centuries will work out to an error of several years. Since, on other arguments, we've already narrowed the range down to just a handful of years, the reign of Zedekiah is not going to help us narrow the range down any further. Possibility number two is the time of Jesus' birth. We have information on that from both the Nephite calendar and Old World calendars. The trouble is, that's the date we're trying to figure out here, so we can't assume an answer to that question. Then there's number three. The most helpful date for our analysis will be the date of the crucifixion. In the first 3 videos in this series, we determined that that was April 3rd, AD 33 on the Julian calendar. From 3rd Nephi, we know that that was the 4th day of the first month of the 34th year on the Nephite calendar. This is great. If we've done our analysis correctly, we now have 2 dates we can pair up. April 3rd, AD 33 Julian equals 4th day of the first month of the 34th year Nephite. The Book of Mormon provides one crucial data point not found in any other source. It appears to give us the length of Jesus' life. If, as appears likely, the Book of Mormon chronology is using the date of Jesus' birth as their January 1st, the first day of their year, then that would mean that Jesus was born on month 1, day 1, year 1. If he dies on day 4, month 1, year 34, then that gives us a lifespan of 33 Nephite years plus 3 days. So now we can do some math and answer the question, right? Well, there are 2 issues we're going to run into. Number 1, we still don't know the exact length of a Nephite year. And number 2, it is not 100% certain from the text that the Nephites are counting their calendar from the actual day of Jesus' birth, or are they reckoning their calendar just from that year? We'll talk about each in turn. First is the length of a Nephite year. I'll be drawing on some research done by John Pratt. There's a link to his website in the video description. There appear to be 3 viable possibilities for the length of a Nephite year. They could have used a strictly lunar calendar. They certainly would have known about lunar calendars from the Jews. That would be a year length of 354 days. Most Book of Mormon geographers hold that the Nephites lived in Mesoamerica, in which case we can look at Mayan calendars that would have been familiar to them. The Mayan Tun count is 360 days, and the Mayan Hab count is 365. Additionally, as Pratt points out, the Egyptian calendar, very accurate for its time, prior to Lehi's departing from Jerusalem, had a 365-day count. And that's something that Lehi would have been aware of. Now, some cultures that use a lunar calendar are okay with the fact that Your months are going to cycle through the seasons because your year is more than 11 days short. But many cultures using a lunar calendar will intercalate their calendar. They'll add what is called an intercalary month, or what we might call a leap month, on a periodic basis in order to keep the months and the seasons in alignment. If the Nephites intercalated their calendar on a haphazard basis, well, that's the end of the discussion. We would have no way of calculating how many days 33 years plus 3 days means. However, given the fact that the Nephites placed tremendous emphasis on their chronology, from their own account, they tracked it carefully. They lived in a time and place where chronology was known and well understood and thoroughly studied. More likely than not, if they're using a lunar calendar, they are intercalating it on a regular basis. There's a system, it's not random. If you take a lunar calendar and properly intercalate it, you will end up with an average length of year over a decent amount of time of pretty close to 365 days. Won't be exact, but it'll be close. Furthermore, yes, the Mayan tun count was 360 days. However, they knew that a year was not 360 days. They knew it was pretty close to 365. The Mayans were, in fact, pretty good at math. So that's another vote for 365. We're going to investigate all three of these possibilities, acknowledging that the best argument out there is a Nephite calendar was probably 365 days, but it could have been something else. With that said, let's calculate out how many days 33 years plus 3 days would be, given these assumed lengths of years. For a strictly 354-day calendar, 33 years plus 3 days equals 11,685 days. Now, technically, a lunar year is just a tiny bit longer than 354 days, and so you'd occasionally have a 355-day year in the mix. If we allow for that and use a strictly lunar year, then you would add 12 days to this number, giving you a total count of 11,697 days. If we use a 360-day year, our number becomes 11,883. And if we use a 365-day year, we end up with a lifespan for Jesus of 12,048 days. And again, if they're using a lunar calendar that is regularly and carefully intercalated, you might not get this number exactly, but you'll get something pretty close to it. So we've got a decent argument for 12,048 with some other possibilities that we'll need to consider as well. So we certainly could come up with all manner of hypothetical explanations for how long a Nephite year might be. We just wouldn't really have any good evidence for them. These are the three cases where we can at least make a decent argument. So now let's go ahead and subtract each of these plausible lengths of Jesus' lifespan on the Julian calendar from April 3rd, AD 33, which would give us our closest estimate to the date of Jesus' birth. If Jesus' lifespan was 11,685 days, and he died on April 3rd, AD 33, that would mean that he was born April 6th, AD 1. And if we allow the extra 12 days here, because technically a lunar year is slightly longer than 354, you go back 12 days, you get March 25th, AD 1. If the Nephite year was 360 days, then that would mean Jesus was born September 20th, 1 BC. And if we use a 365-day count, which we said was the best argument out there, then we would get April 8th, 1 BC. This is exciting. For the first time in our analysis, we're actually talking about real fixed dates on the calendar. There are some assumptions we've had to make, and we'll talk a little bit more, but these would be bullseye calculations if we have correctly estimated the length of the Nephite year. So we'll have a little more discussion about these in a minute, but first we need to talk about the second concern I raised. It is not 100% clear from the Book of Mormon that the Nephites are reckoning from the actual date of Jesus' birth. Could they be reckoning from the nearest equinox or solstice, or maybe just waiting for a new moon? These common, regular occurring astronomical features often served as anchor points in ancient calendars. So we do need to ask the question, could they be counting from one of these days, but the birth occurred either a little bit before that or a little bit after, and they either forward dated or backdated their calendar so they could keep it tied to something like an equinox or a solstice? Well, we can simplify our analysis a little bit by pointing out what we learned from the Chronology of Herod video previously. We determined the absolute latest possible date of Jesus' birth was December of 1 BC. That means 354 days is out. Jesus was not born on any of these days. They would be too late. So really, we've got two options we need to consider. Now, it certainly is possible that the day, night, and a day sign was not used as January 1st on the calendar, but rather they referenced a regular astronomical event that happened shortly thereafter. The problem is this. These are the dates from which they're counting, given these assumptions about their length of year. And we know when there were equinoxes, solstices, and new moons in 1 BC, and neither of these dates fall on an equinox, a solstice, or a new moon, nor do any of those astronomical events occur on a date adjacent to one of these days. So the question we have to ask is this. Why anchor their calendar to these otherwise obscure dates? Sure, there are hypothetical reasons, but there's nothing from the astronomical data to say, yes, they should count from one of these days unless that actually is the day of the sign of Jesus' birth. So I think there actually is a fairly good argument that one of these days could be the date we're looking for. But that said, we've tried to be cautious in the inferences we draw from the historical data. We've been talking about ranges rather than individual dates because we do want to be accurate. And so here's what I will propose. It is likely that the Nephites counted from a date within 6 months, plus minus 6 months, of the date of the sign. That is, if they wanted to wait for the regular New Year's on their calendar, maybe they said, okay, we saw the sign, they wait till New Year's, and they say, now this is Anno Domini, as we would call it. This is the year of our Lord because it's the first New Year's after Jesus was born. That's possible. Or, if he was born shortly after their New Year's, they could have backdated the calendar and said, this is year 1 because it is the year in which Jesus is born, but we're not going to change what we call New Year's. In that case, with these dates, we would go plus minus 6 months as our range of plausible dates for Jesus' birth. But I'm going to be even more generous to the ancient chronologers to make sure we throw a net wide enough that we absolutely capture the right date. We're going to go plus minus 12 months. Allow that at the absolute most, stretch the text as far as it'll go. Same kind of analysis we did with Luke. The sign must have been within 12 months of the date from which they're counting. We determined these are the two best candidates for the date from which they're counting. If they were counting from a date more than 12 months before or after the sign, then they would not have in fact been counting from the year of Jesus' birth, which they explicitly say they do. Thus, the absolute earliest possible date of Jesus' birth would be 1 year before our earlier date. It would be in the spring of 2 BC. And rather than saying April 8th, 2 BC, I'm going to say the spring, because we noted if they're using a regularly intercalated lunar calendar, they might not be counting from April 8th, but they'll be counting from a date close to it. So to be cautious, we'll say the absolute earliest possible date of Jesus' birth is in the spring of 2 BC. Now, if we go plus 12 months from here, that would get us to the fall of AD 1. And we would say, based on the Nephite chronology alone, the latest possible date of Jesus' birth would be in the fall of AD 1. But watch out, Herod, we already determined Jesus must have been born no later than December of 1 BC. This means that now we don't only have a couple of possible solid dates, but we have a really solid range to work with. Based on the Nephite chronology, we can say that the earliest possible date of Jesus' birth was in the spring of 2 BC, and the latest possible date was in December of 1 BC. A remarkably tight range for something that happened 2,000 years ago. If our objective is to minimize type 2 errors and not make any statement that we cannot really solidly historically stand behind, then here's our answer. Jesus was born sometime between the spring of 2 BC and the end of 1 BC. And that's as far as we'll take the argument in this video. I believe the data we have considered provide a wealth of support to this conclusion. This range is fully consistent with the chronology in the Book of Mormon, and it's fully consistent with all of the other chronology we've considered. It works with the ranges we came up with for the possible dates of Herod's death. All of these dates are within the broad range we came up with from our analysis of Luke, and all of them are within the narrow range we came up with, the range of highest probability from our analysis of Luke. And we're talking about a set of dates that work pretty well with the patristic evidence, the early Christian writers who estimated Jesus' birth sometime between 3 BC and 1 BC. So we've got a confluence of evidence here. Every data point we have considered is consistent with this range. We've tried to be very cautious in our use of evidence, and so if we adopt an equally cautious yet rigorous conclusion, when was Jesus born? This is my answer. In the next video, which will be the last video in the series, we'll go one step further. If we're willing to make an educated guess, since we know not all dates along this spectrum are equally probable, can we narrow it down any further? In the final video in the series, I will offer an educated guess as to what date is the most probable date of Jesus' birth.